Taking a look now at the different types of operating systems. Before we jump into the current versions of the operating systems, I'd like to cover a little bit of history. For example, the very first operating system. A lot of folks don't know who created the very first operating system. Many people think that it came from Microsoft or Apple. In fact, the very first operating system is credited to a Dr. Gary Kildall. Dr. Gary Kildall is considered the creator of the very first operating system. Now, there's some lore, there's a story about how the very first operating system came about. And here is the story. You have to remember when this was all starting, Apple Computers was a nothing company. They were nobody. They were a garage company. Nobody had ever heard of them. And all of a sudden, people are buying Apple Computers. I mean, this just takes off like a wildfire. And people are buying these Apple Computers, and people are bringing these Apple Computers to their place of employment to do work. Now, you're IBM. You are this company that's been around forever. You're the big blue. And you're going to your offices that you service that are your customers, and you're noticing people are not using the massive mainframes that you're selling them. People are using these little weird things that sit on their desk and work for them. So IBM had a real struggle here. They had a real challenge. Here was this upstart company that was taking over a market share of something that was never around before, and you are the computer people. And IBM was the computer place. And so IBM had to come up with a personal computer in a very short period of time. In doing so, they both succeeded and eventually wound up killing off their personal computer business for the most part, because nothing that IBM put together in the first personal computer was really IBM. They were taking basically parts off the shelf, putting them in a case. None of the parts were theirs, the cases weren't theirs, and the operating system wasn't theirs. So IBM initially approached a company called Microsoft. Now, of course, you've heard of a company called Microsoft. You can't have had electricity and running water and not have heard of a company called Microsoft. Well, back then, Microsoft was another one of these know-nothing companies. Bill who? Bill Fence? Bill what? Bill Gates. Who's Bill Gates? Well, we all know who Bill Gates is, right? And all these folks. So when IBM approached Microsoft, Microsoft wasn't in the operating system business. Now, appreciate that for a second. Microsoft, the makers of Windows, weren't making operating systems. They were an application company. They were making different applications. They weren't doing operating systems. Now, keep in mind now they're a multi-billion-dollar world business. But back then, they didn't have operating systems. And so the story goes that Microsoft sent them to Dr. Gary Kildall. And the lore has it that Dr. Gary Kildall wasn't there. Either he had left when IBM showed up or he wasn't there when IBM showed up. The point is that he wasn't there to answer the call. And IBM and them had some whatever going on. So IBM went back to Microsoft. You know, there's a saying, when opportunity knocks, you answer the door, and it rarely knocks a second time. Well, in this case, IBM came knocking on Microsoft's door again. And Bill Gates, being who Bill Gates was, wasn't going to let this pass by him. And so he said, not a problem, we'll come up with an operating system for you. I'm assuming that's what he said, as far as, I don't know exactly what he said, but that was the general gist of things. And so Microsoft wound up going to a local computer store and buying the rights to a program called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. Now, keep in mind, buying the rights, if you watch the very popular show Shark Tank, which is a great show, by the way, if you watch Shark Tank, you know Mr. Wonderful, and he does a lot of rights deals. He does a lot of royalty deals, and where he will sell the right to build something to another company or a right to produce something to another company. Well, that's what happened here. Microsoft did not create QDOS. They bought the rights to QDOS. They revamped it a little bit and then sold it to IBM as PC-DOS. Now, at this point in time, the multi-billion-dollar company had begun. Now, it wasn't multi-billion yet, but it was starting. It was well on its way. History would show that this was probably the big thing that led to Microsoft being who Microsoft is today. Now, the funny thing is, QDOS, the operating system that Microsoft bought and then repackaged as PC-DOS, QDOS, was a programmer's version of CP/M OS. CP/M OS was the creation of Dr. Gary Kildall. And most of you have never heard of Dr. Gary Kildall until today. Most people out there never heard of him, but he was the father of the operating system. Now, in case you're getting your hate on for Microsoft, don't, because now let's talk about Apple. And by the way, this is really cool stuff. I'm just glossing the surface. If you want to know more about the history of PCs, check out that video I told you about in the previous lesson, The Triumph of the Nerds. Excellent, excellent video. I used to always show it to my class every year. Really kind of cool. Anyhow, the first graphic user interface. Remember we talked about GUI previous video? GUI graphic user interface. A lot of people think that the first GUI, the first graphic user interface, was created by Apple. Wrong. The first graphic user interface was created by a company called Xerox. You might have heard of them. You know, the copy people? Well, Xerox had a think group called Xerox PARC. And Xerox PARC was supposed to be the brain trust that was to guide Xerox into the future of technology. And these guys were brilliant. They came up with the first graphic user interface. They also came up with the first networking of computers. And they also came up with the very first mouse. None of these things existed outside of Xerox PARC. Well, somehow Steve Jobs heard about this, went on a tour, was amazed at what he saw, and arranged for a group of his programmers to come take a look at what Xerox had created. Now, there's a whole bunch of lore about this as well. Again, check out Triumph of the Nerds to see what was up with that. But Steve Jobs and his folks came back to Apple, and they began a project called the Lisa Project. Now, you've probably never heard of the Lisa computer. And there's good reason for it, because there really was no Lisa computer. It was a disaster. Steve Jobs was in charge of it. It wound up becoming way over budget. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Basically, what was going on here is Apple was looking at the possible death of the company. Think about this. No iPads, no iPhones, no iMacs, no Apple anything. Think of what the world would be like today, because the iPhone really drove the smartphone market to be what it is. Tablets, these are nothing new, but it took Apple to make them, gotta haves. And I got a paperclip stuck to the magnetic part. So imagine a world where Apple and Steve Jobs' vision of the future wasn't there. So Lisa was a disaster, and they wound up removing Steve Jobs from the project. And so again, as story goes, Steve Jobs was walking around the Apple company, and he found this very small group of computer programmers who were working on the Macintosh project. Why was it the Macintosh project? Because it was everyone's favorite Apple. And he took that over, and they launched the very first commercial version of the graphic user interface with the Mac. Later on, Microsoft introduced the PC version of the very first graphic user interface with their release of Windows. And now the lawsuits happen. And they happen, and they happen, and they happen. So here's a little quick history for you. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you want to learn more about the history of computers, be sure to check out that video. It is really, really, really super cool. So what's currently on the market? What are the current operating systems? Of course, we have the Windows, we have the Mac. We know what those are. We also have Linux, we have mobile, and we have Unix. Now notice I don't have anything really in the Unix column because I'm not a Unix expert, and I didn't want to put something there and then have the Uber Geeks rain down condescending comments on me. So we're just going to say Unix, different versions, they're out there. And Unix is the big daddy of operating systems. This is the very powerful operating system that runs a lot of the internet. So Microsoft Windows. Of course, we have XP. Funny thing about XP, Windows has been trying to kill off XP now for years, and it won't die. In fact, as the recording of this video, a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft was saying, we're done with XP. No more patches, no more updates, we're done. And all the bad guys out there, all the bad computer hackers were going, because they had their viruses and their malware waiting to go. And they were ready to take down entire networks of computers still running XP. Well, here's the funny thing about Windows XP. As you know from previous videos, I used to work for the federal government. I spent about 1.5 years, 2 years working for the FBI, and I spent about another 2 years working for the intelligence community. The United States federal government runs on Windows XP. Now, not all computers are XP. Some are Windows 2000, and some are more up-to-date, but for the most part, it's a Windows XP world. And so the idea that all of these vulnerabilities would now be available and all these bad guys were going to basically hack the federal government kind of put the fear of God in a few people. Well, what wound up happening is other federal governments, other central governments from other countries like Australia and other ones were like, no, 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 don't. We need XP. And so Microsoft went, fine, we'll support XP for a little bit longer, but get your stuff together because we really want you to buy the new versions. And so XP remains. If you work for the government, you're probably going to use XP. The next version of Windows that was released was Windows Vista. Now, if you are an old-timer geek like myself, you might remember Windows ME. Windows ME was a disaster. It was one of the worst operating systems I've ever had the displeasure of working with. Windows Vista was Windows ME's grandchild. This thing came back and people hated it. It was just icky. Windows 7, I liked Windows 7. I thought Windows 7 was the operating system we should have had years ago. Windows 8 is the current version as the recording of this video. I have to tell you, I don't use Windows 8. I switched to a Mac. Nothing against Windows 8. I know some people like it. I know some people don't like it, but that's the current version. And we've had server versions of all the different types of operating systems. Servers are very powerful computers that basically run networks. I don't really get into servers too much in the intro videos. I have an entire series on Network Plus that you're more than welcome to check out, and we definitely talk about servers, both the hardware and the operating systems in more detail. Now, switching gears to fanboydom, or fanboyism, I guess, which would be the Mac OS X. Mac OS X, operating system 10, that's what the X stands for. We're using Roman numerals here. Don't call it Mac OS X. People will laugh at you. So it's Mac OS X, and they've been named after the big cat. So we've had leopard, we've had snow leopard, we've had lion, we've had mountain lion, and now the current release is Mavericks. Maybe they ran out of cats, don't know. The next thing is Linux. Linux has distros. Linux is an open source operating system, meaning you can download it for free. You can see the source code, how it was written, basically what's under the hood. You can tweak it, you can release it yourself, but you have to release it so other people can also download it and see it and tweak it, etc., etc. So we have distros. We have different distributions of Linux, different flavors of Linux. And we have Ubuntu, we have Debian, we have Slackware, we have SUSE, and we have Fedora. These are popular distros of Linux. And please, if you're a Linux fanboy out there and I mispronounced one of these, again, easy with the hate mail there, apologize. Then we have mobile operating systems. These are operating systems that are on your mobile devices, for example, your phones and your tablets. We have Android, otherwise known as Droid. This is the stuff that comes from Google. It is based, from my understanding, off of Linux. We have BlackBerry or Crackberry. BlackBerry was the pioneer originally of smartphones. Now, poor BlackBerry is, well, people aren't buying BlackBerry phones. People aren't going, oh, I got to get the latest BlackBerry phone. Some people might, but for the most part, the market share is held by both the Android and the next one, which is the iOS. That is the Mac operating system for their iPhones. So that's predominantly the big market share, although Droid is taking over more of the market share. And then we have Windows Phone. Moving on. If you'd like to play with Linux, let's say that you want to give Linux a shot, you can download copies of Linux, again, for free. But if you don't want to commit, you can actually put the install on a CD. Let me put that back. You can put an install on the CD or a USB drive and run it from your RAM, so you don't actually have to install it. So you can go to either Knoppix or you can go to Ubuntu. You can download and install. You can put it on your CD or USB. To me, CD, actually DVD, works better to run. It's easier to install it on the DVD than on a flash drive. You have to do a couple extra steps with a flash drive to get it to work. And you can run a copy of Linux on your own computer. I've had to do this both personally and for business, where I've had to install Linux on a computer to actually fix a Windows computer because it was completely trashed. I have actually installed Ubuntu on our home computer. My 9-year-old decided that he wanted to install a skin for Minecraft, and I told him, you're going to be responsible for your tech support. And he installed a virus, got all sorts of malware on there, wiped the computer, popped on Ubuntu. It's like, you're going to be a geek whether you want to or not. Anyhow, that's it for me for this one. Our next video is our last video in the software series. We're going to take a look at application software.